this might sound strange, but we realized we were designing a facility that was meant to last for hundreds or thousands of years. You're there in the midst of sort of the sum total of what our ancestors have passed down to us. You know, every one of those seed samples is a success story, an unbroken success story from the beginning of agriculture to that sample. And it also represents everything that agriculture can be. It's all the options, it's all the colors on an artist's palette for the future of agriculture. So it is a huge, huge responsibility.
Cary, hi. Can you tell us about your work with the Global Seed Vault?
It's a facility near the North Pole. It's built inside of a mountain. And there we're conserving seed samples of different, let's say, varieties of our agricultural crops. At the moment, there are more than 1 million samples of different crop varieties in that facility. But of course, it didn't just spring up overnight. In my case, it's an issue I've been working on for 40 years. And a lot of that was convincing governments that this was important, and solving a number of little problems along the way, leading to the realization that actually, if we were going to conserve this diversity and conserve it forever, we needed a plan B in case all the little plan A's, which are seed banks in different countries, in case any of those had a problem, and they always, they're in buildings, so, you know, they burn down sometimes, there's a flood, or they get caught in the middle of a war. We needed a plan B so that in those kind of situations, it wouldn't be a big extinction event. You wouldn't just see the last of a certain variety. We'd have a backup copy somewhere. So that's sort of what I've been doing. And I've been involved as an advocate in non-government organizations, as a professor, as an employee of the United Nations, as a head of an organization that was supposed to, well, had the mandate to put together a global system for this. It's quite a mandate.
Now, it's not just, you know, you would think like, oh, you put these seeds in there and you forget about them, but there have been famines or fires, and we've had to go back to the seed bank to repopulate those plants. So how soon after you started the seed bank did you realize how important and valuable this institution was going to be?
Well, in a tiny way, I guess, of course, I realized that on day one, because I know that a lot of national seed banks around the world, we have a big one in the United States in Fort Collins, Colorado. They have many, many samples that they're conserving, and they're sort of like libraries. And you expect that every once in a while in a library, you lose a book or one gets destroyed. Well, the same thing happens in a seed bank. So I knew that there was this sort of drip, drip, drip of extinction going on in seed banks. But what really brought it to the fore was what happened in Syria after Arab Spring. And there was a big international agricultural research center located just outside of Aleppo, Syria, beautiful city. It was not a Syrian
back then.
Well, it was then, yes. Now it's not. But it was an international center, not a national facility, and they were conserving crop diversity principally from that region, and they were some of the main plant breeders for new higher yielding varieties of wheat, barley, lentils, chickpeas for the Mideast. So they were really a foundation for food security in that region, which is pretty important. Well, obviously, you know, that center was threatened by the war there. In fact, I think today you can go on YouTube and you can see videos of guys standing out front of the main headquarters building, you know, firing rifles into the sky. I mean, it's just absurd. So the staff had to abandon the facility, the international staff did. And it was one of the world's major collections of those crops I just mentioned, like wheat. And not just useful for people in that region, but useful for us here in the United States. If we want also drought tolerant, heat resistant, pest disease resistant wheat, for example. So, but fortunately, we had worked with the head of that institution and the staff, and we got the final shipment of duplicate copies of their seed collection out of Syria just, I think, about 2 weeks before all hell broke loose.
Wow.
And so what happened then was that after they reconstituted the institution, so to speak, in another country, we were able to restore their copy and therefore keep their research and their plant breeding going. And we avoided this, what otherwise could have been an extinction event.
You know, how important is it that they be in multiple places? You know, science now is not, you know, it's not, you know, this science is all going to be done in one place. You know, some experiments are so big they have to be done by, you know, the whole world, you know, like if you're going to look into outer space, you know, if you're going to look deep into space, you know, but it's collegial, not competitive, you know, with collecting these seeds and saving this diversity. You know, how do you think about that?
Well, I hope it's collegial. It hasn't always been. It's sometimes been very controversial and adversarial, and people, you know, claiming ownership over this material, this biological diversity. I kind of choose to think of it myself as a common heritage of mankind, that our agricultural crops were by and large domesticated before there was any nation state. And we're all really dependent on this diversity. I think 131 out of 195 countries in the world are net food importers. And if you look at the kind of foods that you and I eat, they're predominantly foods that come from other countries. I think on average, people around the world will have a diet that's 65% composed of foods that didn't even originate in their region. So they and the agricultural systems that produce the food they eat really need this diversity from all over the world to have a modern and productive and efficient agricultural system. So we're all kind of knitted together, and that to me means that it behooves us to cooperate.
You know, do you ever find seeds, you know, like you know, sometimes I was in me and Priscilla went to a film festival. Where was the film festival, Priscilla? Was in
We've been to many.
well, but the one in the mountains that we went to. What?
Telluride.
Telluride.
Telluride?
In Telluride, yeah. And you know, it's like you have all, you know, I assume they're pine trees, but then every once in a while you have a place where there's just a bunch of birch trees, right? And it was a you know, there was a house there 100 years ago, and somebody was hell-bent on putting birch trees there, and then the house, you know, they moved on or passed away, and then the house disappeared into the ground, but those trees go on. Do you ever find, you know, plants like in the middle of some place that were probably domesticated, but you know, how and why they're there, you don't really know? Do you ever find mysteries like that?
Yeah, absolutely. I think today in Europe, one of the places where you would find some of the old varieties and also some wild relatives of our agricultural crops would be in cemeteries, where the yards are not so carefully, you know, manicured. And I remember, if I can just tell you a short story about a plant I came across. I was living in North Carolina, and a woman who was a county commissioner came to visit me. She knew the kind of work I was involved in. And she asked me if I knew the source of a particular variety of apple called a Magnum Bonum. I had just completed a study of what I thought to be extinct apple varieties, looking at lists from the 1800s and checking to see if we had them in collections today. And I said, you know, I don't think that apple's still around. And I checked my list, and there it was. It was an apple we could document from the 1800s, but no longer in any collection. I said, well, it's extinct. I said, by the way, where did you find those apples when you were a little girl? And she said, oh, every year my father would drive me up to Cana, Virginia, and we would get apples. And I said, well, where in Cana, Virginia? And she remembered. She said, oh, it's the Willie Jones orchard. And so one day in January, it was a miserable day, raining, and it was a weekend and I didn't have anything to do. I got in the car and I headed to Cana, Virginia. And believe it or not, on the outskirts of Cana, Virginia, there was this old weathered sign that had an arrow pointing and it said Jones Orchard. And I drove up there, downpour, and I knocked on the back door of this house. That gets you shot in some places. And a guy came to the door and he said, "What do you want?" And I said, "Well, I'm here to, ask you about your apples." And he looked at me, and I mean, I can't make up the story. He said, "I guess you're here to ask me about those Magnum Bonum apples." I said, "Yes." And I said, "Do you have any?" And he said, "My father and I cut those trees down about 20 years ago and replaced the whole orchard." And then he kind of smiled and he said, "But we always thought somebody would come asking for them. So we saved 3 trees."
Wow.
And I said, "Do you know which 3?" He said, "Sure, get in the truck." And we headed out to the middle of this orchard. And he said, "It's these 3. I said, "Do you mind if I take a few twigs?" And he said, "Yeah, sure." Well, the way you propagate apple varieties is you graft them. So I used those twigs, I grafted them, and now you can Google it. Many nurseries are selling Magnum Bonum apples. So it sort of came back from the brink, if you will, based on 3 trees and one guy's feeling that maybe somebody would come and ask for them someday.
Right. Are they delicious? I mean, first of all, why would they chop them down? And what did this, like you had the nostalgia for your grandmother's tomato. This woman remembers an apple from her youth.
Yeah.
Do the apples exist now? Have they been planted?
Yeah, they're good. I mean, I have about 100 different varieties of apples here on the farm. And it's quite something to walk down the row and see different colors. Some are virtually black. Some are red when you cut them open. They have different shapes. They have dramatically different tastes. So it's just, to each one's pleasure. Love is beauty is in the eye of the beholder. And so we have Magnum Bonum, and I have some Magnum Bonum now as well.
Coming over after the pandemic to get one of those.
When you've got an apple called Magnum Bonum, the greatest good, it's got to be at least okay.
It's got to be kind of an incredible to see. Do they all bloom at the same time? Do they all bear fruit at the same time?
No, it's very different. And, I have my favorites. I have a variety called Asophus Spitzenberg, which actually comes from the little village of Asophus across the river, Hudson River from us. And now this is an interesting thing about heirloom, the old varieties and whether they're better, equal, worse. That was Thomas Jefferson's favorite apple. And he tried to grow it at Monticello, but it didn't do very well in Monticello. It's a New Yorker apple. So he never really succeeded so much in Monticello. And I guess he sort of imported his favorite apples from New York. But it grows really well here. And it's a beautiful apple that you can use for a lot of different purposes.
So, I had a friend who brought me some little seeds for growing giant trees, and after the seeds sort of died off because I didn't really realize you have to plant them to plant redwoods, right? Like not like who knows how long that would have taken to become something. But how did you figure out how to store the seeds, and why did you select this particular place to build the repository?
The conditions for storage are reasonably well known. At least there's a common practice amongst seed banks around the world. The 2 big variables are you dry the seeds down to a low moisture content, and that reduces the biological activity inside the seed, and you freeze them, and that further reduces the activity. And if you do that properly, seeds can last for a long time, and that's what you want. You don't want a seed just dying out in the first year. You want to save it for a long time. So the answer to the second question is why did we decide to do it in in this location. It's well, I was living in Norway at the time. I was actually connected with a university there, and Norway actually had used this area, Svalbard, an archipelago, which is above mainland Norway, as a place to store a backup copy for a Nordic collection of seeds. So there was a little bit of a history of doing it there. I think there's one tiny little woody plant that grows in Svalbard. Basically, there are no gardens, there are no farms. It's a place where the polar bear outnumber the people. So it seemed like a good location. I think it was cold. We wanted a place that was naturally frozen, because if you're going to produce if you're going to try to build a facility that's a real backup, that's an insurance policy for all these seed banks around the world, you don't want to deal with equipment failures with the implications of that. So we wanted a place that would remain naturally frozen, even if the equipment went off. And that fit the bill. And inside of a mountain, a lot safer than a building. And then there was the question of just Norway. It was a trusted country. You know, I don't have to name other countries to say that they wouldn't have been trusted, but the fact is that most of the world trusted Norway to do a good job of this. And then finally, after some discussions with the Norwegians, they said they would fund it. That's not trivial either. It didn't cost a lot of money in the scheme of things, but there we had a trusted government in a good location, and we could get the seeds in and out. It was remote, absolutely remote. It's like an hour and a half jet flight from the northernmost tip of mainland Norway, but it's still accessible. And so it was safe, but we, had a degree of safety there. And it was just a great location.
So you decide you're going to put it there. Now, so what's step two? Like, how big is it inside?
It's, if you visualize, it's the entrance, there's one entrance, a double door, and you just go straight into the mountain. About 130 meters straight into the mountain. And that kind of deposits you, if you will, into a much larger room. And off that room are three vault rooms.
Right.
And each of those rooms would be, I don't know, close to the size of a basketball court.
Right.
And we have seeds now stored in one of the three rooms. I guess I was the one that actually did the estimate of how many samples we could possibly store, would possibly need to store. In other words, how much diversity there is. But having made mistakes before in my life, I, upped that estimate. And having made some big mistakes in my life, I decided, well, let's up it again. And so we ended up with 3 times as much room as we think we'll really need. So we're planning ahead.
Now what's in there? Are they just shelving units, or are they little boxes where you put what does it look like if we were to look inside at the room where all the seeds are? What will we see?
It looks a bit like a warehouse. It looks like, metal shelves with boxes on it. And inside the boxes, we'll have the seeds from a particular institute. And inside those boxes might be 400, 500 little packets of seeds.
Mm-hmm. Is that about how many packets you need of a variety to save its diversity? Yeah,
generally we think of these varieties more like populations. They are actually diverse within themselves too. They're not uniform varieties typically. So about 500 seeds per population is what we get.
Do they need different levels of, cold or not, or is everything at the same level, or how are you monitoring temperature inside there?
Yeah, that's not a question I get very often, and it's a clever one. we keep everything at the same temperature, which is minus 18 Celsius. And the reason is that's what a really good seed bank around the world would keep their seeds at. And since this is not a time capsule, we wanted a management regime such that our seeds would not deteriorate any more quickly than the seeds, the copy of the seeds that the depositor had. So in other words, when the depositor says it checks the germination of their samples and they say, the germination's declining a little bit, we better take a few seeds out, grow them, and get fresh new seed, they would send them to us. They would send a portion of those seeds to us, and we'd replenish our samples. So there's a constant turnover, albeit very, very slowly. And I don't know the answer to your question. There is some research going on to figure out, well, and it would stand to reason that maybe some species would prefer colder temperatures and some warmer. I don't know, but we store them at minus 18, which is what, minus 2 or 3 Fahrenheit. And at that level, we figure that, these seeds will last for decades. I mean, we do have some experimental results on how long the seeds will remain viable. And it goes anywhere from, I don't know, a few decades, 50 to the shortest lived species to over 19,000 years for a crop like sorghum.
Now, do you, how often do you take them out and look at them and see how they're doing?
We don't.
Yeah.
I think the breakthrough for actually constructing this facility was not the idea of constructing it. It wasn't the architect's drawing necessarily. It wasn't the location. It was a management plan, and figuring out, well, how are we going to manage this? And I suppose there were a couple of conceptual breakthroughs in that regard. One was that we would operate it like a safety deposit box at the bank, where we would essentially own, I'm now talking very expensively, the government of Norway would own the facility, but the depositor, the National Seed Bank in the United States or wherever, would own their copy that was deposited there. And we said, we're not going to do anything with it. If you want it back, we send it to you, but otherwise we don't even open the box. And you, on the other hand, of course, have the responsibility for making sure the seeds are viable. And how do you know that they're viable? Because we're storing them under the best conditions possible. So they're not going to deteriorate more quickly than your copy of them. So when you need a fresh new copy for your purposes, send us a bit, and we will take them.
Have you been surprised by, how many different groups are using the seed bank? What it's grown into?
A little bit. I always expected that it would be a little bit of a tough slog at the beginning, just to convince some institutions and some governments to utilize it. They would, it's just natural that some governments move more slowly than others, and they like to wait and look and see if everything's operating correctly before they commit. And that's been the case. I've had journalists say, well, were you surprised that all countries didn't deposit seeds on day one? And my response is always no. I would been flabbergasted if they had. That's just not the way the world works. Mm-hmm. So, but I think with 1 million samples there, we really have the bulk of the diversity of our major crops already conserved.
When you think about, when I first started reading about what you were doing, I of course took it to the post-apocalyptic. This would be also a place, just in case really bad things happen, and bad things happen. And as Jesse said in the beginning, we have really climate crisis. We're struggling. Do you think that, first of all, how do you think about the ongoing protection of this thing to be passed along, and the care of which you built it with your colleagues to make sure that over time, I may imagine you want to preserve and it goes on as humankind goes on? Like, how are you thinking about its legacy, I guess, for you?
This might sound strange, but we realized we were designing a facility that was meant to last for hundreds or thousands of years. And at one point, I guess I I thought, well, when was the last time a human being sat down to seriously try to design something that was going to be useful and last for 1,000 or more years? In this case, as long as we need agriculture. So we tried really hard to think of everything that could go wrong. And I can't promise or guarantee you that we did a perfect job of that. And I can't promise or guarantee that nothing could go wrong, but we sure thought about a lot of different things that could go wrong. It's one of the reasons we built it inside of a mountain. But it is a humbling experience, and for people who've been able to go into the mountain and walk down the shelves and see these boxes from all different countries, it can be a very emotional experience too, because you realize that you're there in the midst of sort of the sum total of what our ancestors have passed down to us. You know, every one of those seed samples is a success story, an unbroken success story from the beginning of agriculture to that sample. And it also represents everything that agriculture can be. It's all the options, it's all the colors on an artist's palette for the future of agriculture. So it is a huge responsibility. And part of our strategy, if you will, to make sure that it really could last for 1,000 years was, interestingly, I think, to make it as simple as possible. Not a lot of high tech. No staff needs to go down there. You know, we realized that this was a facility that was going to have people running around with white lab coats, that all kinds of things could go wrong because people do stupid things and they make mistakes. So we wanted a, you know, it's the old saying, we wanted a foolproof system because sooner or later a fool will be running it. So we wanted the natural coal to keep the seeds alive. We didn't want to have to go in and out all the time. So I think over the last decade that we've had the seed vault up and running, we've done something, I think, kind of remarkable. We haven't lost a single sample.
Now, was it because you were actively day to day running it? Was it hard to let go of that?
It is an emotional experience, you know, and I've told people that some of the best days of my life were down in a tunnel, place with no windows or anything, but it was just a great privilege. And it was a lovely experience working with the people, with even the construction workers and such, who were great people. There weren't that many of them. And the Norwegian government was just excellent, an excellent partner. So, you know,
how often have we had to call upon it to bring some diversity back to a place where a fire or a flood, you know, did it in? Well,
it's so far, I guess it's just been that one case with Syria. It's a little bit like a health insurance policy. You know, you never want to really use it, but you want to have it if you have to have it. And my guess is that as the seed banks who are depositors start to take seeds out of their own collection to regrow them to get more seed, either for conservation purposes or to give to plant breeders for their use in creating a new variety, that, you know, they'll be discovering that, for whatever reason, this sample is kaput and we don't have it anymore, and they're going to have to return to the seed vault for viable seed again. So I would say, unfortunately, I expect it to be used more and more in the future.
You know, why should we collect every variety, every sample that's out there? You know, you could say, well, we have enough apples. You know, why should we collect every single one?
Yeah. There's a conservationist, a famous one in the United States, named Aldo Leopold, and he said that the first rule of successful tinkering is to save all the pieces. And when I think about agriculture, you know, even though it's 12, 15,000 years old, I still think that we're kind of tinkering, and we don't know everything there is to know. And in fact, probably half of the domesticated plants that have entered into commerce and grown for food have never had a scientifically trained plant breeder working on them. So we have to think, particularly in a time of climate change. And by the way, we've had more than 400 consecutive months in which the global average temperature for that month has exceeded the 20th century average for that month. We are entering new climates. We're already there. So the question for agriculture is how and whether our crop plants are going to be adapted to higher temperatures and greater fluctuations and greater extremes and more need for water. And also, are they going to be adapted to the new assemblage of species that are coming together because pests and diseases, insects, they're migrating? And we're involved in a historically unprecedented global experiment with agriculture, with throwing all kinds of new species together because of climate change, for example. So I think, to be a little more direct, but also to look at the big picture, Jesse, the reason we need to do this is that for agricultural crops, rice, wheat, corn, tomatoes, everything, the name of the game is adaptation. These crops have to evolve just like everything else on planet Earth. They can't, if they stay still, they're roadkill. And how do they evolve? They evolve through diversity, through having traits that are selected. Charles Darwin, the first chapter of Origin of Species is about domesticated plants and animals. It's because everybody could tell that these domesticated plants and animals could be bred, they could be improved, they could be adapted. But in the United States, at least, I think we tend to think, we often like to talk about extinction, and everybody's concerned about the polar bears or the whales or this or that. But we look at it in, I think, slightly the wrong way. We look at it as a numbers game. So we're always saying, well, we're down to so many of this type of tiger or so many of this kind of whale, as if when the last one dies, it's extinct. Well, yeah, that's true in some ways. But really, extinction is more of a process than it is an event. And I like to think of extinction as something that takes place when a species loses the ability to evolve successfully to the conditions it finds itself in. So how is it that a species could lose that ability to evolve successfully? And how does that apply to wheat? So, we can drive out into the West and we can see a field that has millions of wheat plants. So if you're in the numbers mentality, you say, well, we got millions of them. We don't need to worry about wheat. But what if they're all exactly alike? Think about dog breeds. What if, I don't want to offend anyone here, but what if every dog breed in the world was a Pekingese?
Right.
And you said, well, there are millions of Pekingese, so we don't have to worry about dogs. I would be worried if that was it. So we need this diversity because we don't know which traits are in these seeds that are going to be absolutely critical for adaptation in the future.
How do you think of things like Monsanto? Do they fulfill a function that's necessary? What's your feeling about that? About copywriting seeds and all of that.
Yeah, I guess in working on the seed vault, it was really necessary to be more than normally humble. And by that was, I mean that we tried to conserve all of diversity essentially in perpetuity. And people would say, well, why don't you just save the best? Or why don't you save everything, but only give it to certain people and not to Monsanto or whatever? And I figured that we're going to have multiple agricultural systems in my lifetime. We're going to have highly industrial, very scientific based plant agricultural systems. And we're going to also have subsistence systems. And that's going to be true as long as I think I'm going to live. And so I think the seed vault had to serve all of those systems. And it's a little bit like it is very much like a public library. I don't want to start picking and choosing who can borrow a book based on what I think they might learn or do with that book, and ditto with the seeds. But I also think, so much of let's face it, so much of the issue around Monsanto and some other companies really has to do with GMOs. And and all of that debate. And I kind of think that when I was executive director of the Global Crop Diversity Trust, I used to sidestep that issue, to be honest with you. And I would say, well, we don't have a dog in that fight. We're trying to conserve diversity for everybody
Right.
For 500 years from now. And okay, maybe there's a fight between the Monsanto people and some other people. And 500 years from now, we'll figure out who was right.
Right.
And whoever was right or who wins that fight will thank us for having saved the diversity. And that's all we're trying to do.
Cary, are you optimistic for the future, even with climate and all these issues?
I'm certainly concerned about climate change. I think it's the biggest challenge that agriculture has ever faced, 12,000 years. I don't think our crops are naturally adapted to climates they haven't seen before or experienced before. And I'm particularly worried about agricultural systems in developing countries, and particularly for crops that don't have a lot of scientific investment in them. I just don't, I think we're going to be surprised, and I think a lot of surprises are not going to be good ones. However, with that dark picture I just painted,
Yeah.
I'm a lot more optimistic than I was 40 years ago when I started the work. Because we actually do have these collections, and they are wonderful, just beautiful collections of this wonderful diversity that's a gift that's been passed down to us. And if we're smart enough to use it, we can solve these problems.
You really are peering back through history when you look at all those seeds, yeah?
Yeah, absolutely. It is a humbling experience because if you go back enough generations, Jesse, Priscilla, our ancestors were the ones that were identifying those seeds. They said, we're going to take seeds from this plant because it's really good or tastes good, and we're going to save it and plant it the next year. Our ancestors domesticated these crops, and and domestication, they brought them into the domicile. That's the word, and they cared for them. And so for all these crops, their evolution is in our hands. And so we have, in a very real sense, an evolutionary responsibility.
Cary, thank
Cary,
you so much.
yeah.
We could spend so much time with you. There's so many things to think about, but the way that you just articulated that, and not only do we have them, but that we're part of them, because food, sustenance of life. So we've ingested them, and our own evolution is obviously tied up to all of it. It's a much more complicated story than I thought before we started talking today. So
Thanks for having me. It's been such a pleasure.
Yeah, thank you. It's good to see you again, and we'll catch up down the road. Thank you very much.
I'm coming for an apple someday. I'm coming for an apple.
I'll visit in the fall.
Okay.
Thank you
Bye,
so
Cary.
much.
Thank you.
Take care. Be safe.
Well,